Hey everyone, welcome back to another epic journey into the Star Wars galaxy. Tonight we're diving deep into one of the most brilliant and terrifying chapters in galactic history, the rise of Grand Admiral Thrawn and the last great Imperial resurgence that nearly brought the New Republic to its knees. This is a story of genius and madness, of art and war, of ancient secrets that echo across the stars. Before we begin this incredible adventure together, if you're ready to explore the tactical brilliance of one of Star Wars' greatest villains, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you love these deep dives into galactic lore, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our journeys to a galaxy far, far away. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. I absolutely love seeing our global community of Star Wars fans come together for these stories. Now, get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, settle into your favorite spot, and prepare yourself for a tale that spans years of conflict and reveals truths that will change everything you thought you knew about the Empire's final stand. Listen closely, for what I'm about to tell you is a story that the New Republic tried to bury. A chronicle that reveals how close the galaxy came to falling back into Imperial darkness, not through the crude power of the Sith, but through the brilliant mind of a being who understood that wars are won not just with weapons, but with understanding the very soul of your enemy. Picture this moment, 5 years after the destruction of the second Death Star, when the galaxy believed the Empire was nothing more than scattered remnants hiding in the Outer Rim. The New Republic celebrated their victories, rebuilding worlds, establishing new trade routes, believing that peace had finally come to the stars. But in the unknown regions, beyond the edge of known space, something ancient was stirring. On the bridge of a massive star destroyer, a figure stood in the shadows, his red eyes gleaming as he studied not battle plans or tactical displays, but something far more revealing. Ancient Twi'lek sculptures, their graceful curves and flowing forms telling him everything he needed to know about how their creators thought, how they fought, how they could be defeated. This was no ordinary Imperial officer. This was Grand Admiral Thrawn, and he possessed a weapon more dangerous than any super weapon the Empire had ever conceived. The art spoke to him in ways that others could never understand. Each brushstroke, each carved line, each color choice revealed the psychological weaknesses of entire species. Where others saw beauty, he saw tactical advantage. Where others admired craftsmanship, he recognized patterns of thought that could be exploited in battle. And as he turned from the sculpture to gaze out at the star field beyond, his lips curved in the faintest of smiles, for he had seen something in those ancient works that chilled him to his core, something that told him the New Republic was not the unified force it appeared to be, but a collection of fractured worlds held together by hope and desperation. And hope, as any student of galactic history knows, is a fragile thing when faced with true strategic genius. In the depths of space, Imperial ships that should not have existed began to move with purpose. Technologies that had been lost were somehow restored. Tactics that defied conventional wisdom proved devastatingly effective. And at the center of it all stood a blue-skinned alien who had sworn an oath not to the Emperor, not to the Empire, but to something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. The chroniclers of this age would later write that in those first quiet months, as Thrawn gathered his forces and studied his enemies, the galaxy held its breath without knowing why. There was a disturbance in the Force, a ripple of unease that even the Jedi could feel but could not identify. Luke Skywalker found his meditations troubled by visions of red eyes and starships moving like pieces on some vast game board. Leia felt a growing dread that she could not name, a sense that the peace they had fought so hard to achieve was about to be tested in ways they could not imagine. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the presence that lurked at the edges of these visions, a shadow that seemed to know things it should not know, a voice that whispered secrets about the Force itself. For Thrawn had not returned alone from the unknown regions. He had brought with him allies whose very existence challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about the Jedi, the Empire, and the delicate balance between light and dark. As we begin this chronicle, remember that every legend starts with a single choice, a moment when destiny pivots on the edge of decision. And in the case of Grand Admiral Thrawn, that choice had been made long before the New Republic even knew his name. He had looked into the abyss of the unknown regions and found not monsters, but mirrors reflecting truths about warfare, about leadership, about the price of peace in a galaxy that had known only conflict for generations. This is the story of how the galaxy's greatest military mind orchestrated a campaign that brought the New Republic to the brink of collapse, not through brute force, but through an understanding of weakness and strength that bordered on the supernatural. So settle in, dear listeners, as we embark on this journey into the heart of Imperial resurgence, where every battle was a work of art and every victory revealed deeper mysteries about the nature of power itself. 5 years had passed since the Battle of Endor, and the galaxy bore the scars of decades of war like an ancient tapestry torn and rewoven countless times. On Coruscant, the gleaming towers that had once housed Imperial bureaucrats now bustled with New Republic officials, their voices echoing through corridors that still whispered of the Empire's dark legacy. The air itself seemed lighter somehow, as if the oppressive weight of tyranny had finally lifted from the urban planet's atmosphere. Yet in the depths of space, far beyond the civilized core worlds, something stirred in the shadows between stars. The unknown region stretched endlessly into the galactic void, a realm where hyperspace routes twisted into impossible geometries and ancient secrets lay buried beneath layers of cosmic dust. It was here, in this forgotten corner of creation, that our story truly begins. Captain Gilad Pellaeon stood on the bridge of the Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera, his weathered face reflecting the blue glow of the navigation displays. At 63, he had served the Empire through its golden age and witnessed its catastrophic fall. His uniform, though immaculate, carried the weight of countless battles, each medal a memory of comrades lost to the rebellion's relentless advance. The bridge around him hummed with quiet efficiency, but Pellaeon could sense the unease among his crew. They were no longer the mighty Imperial Navy that had once ruled the galaxy with iron discipline. They were remnants, survivors clinging to the ghost of an empire that had died with Palpatine above the forest moon of Endor. Their ships were aging, their supplies dwindling, and their morale hung by the thinnest of threads. Many of his fellow officers had already surrendered to the New Republic or disappeared into the anonymity of civilian life, but Pellaeon remained, bound by an oath that transcended politics and ideology. He served not the Empire as it had been, but as it could become again under the right leadership. And that leadership had finally arrived in the most unexpected form. The turbolift doors whispered open, and Grand Admiral Thrawn stepped onto the bridge with the fluid grace of a predator. His blue skin seemed to absorb and reflect the starlight streaming through the viewport, while his red eyes swept across the command stations with analytical precision. Unlike other Imperial officers who relied on intimidation and fear, Thrawn commanded through sheer intellectual superiority. His presence transformed the bridge from a collection of individuals into a single, focused instrument of war. Thrawn was not human, a fact that had made his rise through the xenophobic Imperial hierarchy nothing short of miraculous. He belonged to the Kaiser's species, natives of the unknown regions who valued tactical brilliance above all other virtues. His homeworld lay far beyond the edge of known space, in realms where ancient civilizations had risen and fallen long before the Republic had taken its first tentative steps among the stars. What made Thrawn truly unique was not his alien heritage, but his revolutionary approach to warfare. While other commanders studied military histories and tactical manuals, Thrawn immersed himself in art, culture, and psychology. His private quarters aboard the Chimera resembled a museum more than military accommodations, filled with sculptures, paintings, and artifacts from across the galaxy. Each piece told him something vital about the species that created it, revealing patterns of thought that could be exploited in battle. Pelion had watched in fascination as Thrawn demonstrated this ability time and again. Before engaging Twi'lek pirates, the Grand Admiral would spend hours studying their traditional cave paintings, learning how their ancestors had approached conflict and survival. When planning operations against Mon Calamari defenders, he would examine their architectural styles and musical compositions, understanding how their deep ocean origins influenced their strategic thinking. This was not mere academic curiosity, but a weapon more precise than any turbolaser battery. Thrawn could predict enemy movements not through spy networks or intercepted communications, but through an almost supernatural understanding of how different cultures approached problem solving. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, found order in the apparent randomness of battle. The New Republic leadership, flush with victory and naive about the threats still lurking in the galaxy's darker corners, had made a critical error. They assumed that all Imperial officers thought alike, that they could predict and counter Imperial tactics based on past experience. They had fought and defeated commanders who relied on brute force, overwhelming firepower, and the crude application of fear as a motivational tool. Thrawn represented something entirely different, a fusion of Imperial discipline with an alien perspective that defied conventional military wisdom. He understood that the New Republic's greatest strength was also its most exploitable weakness. Their diversity, the very quality that had enabled them to unite against tyranny, could be turned against them by someone who understood how each member species thought and fought. As Pelion observed the Grand Admiral reviewing intelligence reports from across the galaxy, he began to comprehend the scope of what Thrawn was planning. This would not be another desperate last stand by Imperial remnants, no futile gesture of defiance against inevitable defeat. This was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign that would test every assumption the New Republic had made about their former enemies. The bridge crew moved with renewed purpose as Thrawn issued his orders. Navigation officers plotted courses to systems that most Imperial commanders would have considered strategically worthless. Communications specialists established contact with assets that had remained dormant since the Empire's fall. Supply officers began requisitioning materials for projects whose true purpose remained hidden even from Pella Eon. In his private moments. Pelion wondered about the allies that Thrawn had mentioned, the mysterious figures who had supposedly agreed to support the Grand Admiral's campaign. The unknown regions were home to more than just the Kaiser's ascendancy. Ancient powers slumbered in that void, civilizations that had watched the rise and fall of the Republic and Empire with detached interest. What bargains had Thrawn struck in those distant reaches of space, and what price would the galaxy ultimately pay for his ambitions? The first phase of the campaign was about to begin, and the New Republic had no idea what was coming for them. Decision that would reshape the galaxy's destiny was made not in the grand chambers of Coruscant or the war rooms of Imperial strongholds, but in the quiet solitude of Thrawn's private study aboard the Chimera. Surrounded by artifacts that most beings would consider mere decoration, the Grand Admiral traced his fingers along the surface of an ancient Alderaanian meditation crystal, its faceted surface catching the starlight and refracting it into patterns that spoke of a civilization's deepest philosophical truths. The crystal had survived the destruction of Alderaan, rescued from a museum ship that had been orbiting the system during the Death Star's horrific demonstration of Imperial power. To most observers, it was simply a beautiful remnant of a lost world. To Thrawn, it was a window into the very soul of the people who had created it, revealing their capacity for both profound peace and righteous fury. The Alderaanians had been pacifists by nature, yet when pushed beyond their limits, they had produced leaders like Princess Leia Organa, whose determination had proven instrumental in the Empire's downfall. This understanding of the fundamental contradictions within different species formed the cornerstone of Thrawn's tactical philosophy. Where other commanders saw enemies as statistics to be overcome through superior firepower, he recognized them as complex beings whose cultural programming could be manipulated with surgical precision. The New Republic's greatest champions were also its most predictable opponents, their noble intentions making them remarkably vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Captain Pelion entered the study bearing intelligence reports from across the galaxy, his expression grave as he witnessed Thrawn's methodical examination of yet another cultural artifact. The Grand Admiral's dedication to this seemingly academic pursuit had initially puzzled the veteran officer, but months of observation had convinced him that he was witnessing military genius of an unprecedented order. Thrawn was not merely studying art but decoding the genetic memories of entire civilizations. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a new republic struggling with the immense challenges of governance. The Rebel Alliance had been unified by opposition to imperial tyranny, but peace had revealed the fundamental differences between member worlds that had been temporarily set aside in the name of survival. Mon Calamari admirals clashed with Corellian strategists over fleet deployment. Bothan spy masters pursued their own agendas while paying lip service to senatorial oversight. Even the human worlds, supposedly the most unified bloc in the New Republic, were fragmenting along economic and ideological lines. Thrawn absorbed this information while continuing his study of the meditation crystal, his red eyes reflecting patterns that seemed to shift and change with his thoughts. He understood that the New Republic's internal tensions were not weaknesses to be exploited through conventional sabotage or political maneuvering. They were opportunities for a more elegant form of warfare, one that would turn the Republic's own virtues against itself. The Grand Admiral's campaign would begin not with massive fleet engagements or dramatic terrorist attacks, but with carefully orchestrated incidents designed to exacerbate existing divisions within the New Republic. A Bothan intelligence operation would fail at precisely the moment when Mon Calamari forces needed crucial information. Corellian merchants would find their trade routes mysteriously disrupted, just as they were negotiating new agreements with core world partners. Each incident would appear to be the result of incompetence or bad luck rather than enemy action. As Thrawn set aside the meditation crystal and turned his attention to the intelligence reports, Pelion marveled at the scope of the Grand Admiral's vision. This was not simply a military campaign but a work of art in its own right, each element carefully balanced to create maximum psychological impact with minimum resource expenditure. The New Republic would defeat itself, aided by an enemy who understood its fundamental nature better than its own leaders did. The key to the entire operation lay in recruitment, not of new Imperial officers, but of assets who were already embedded within New Republic society. Former Imperial intelligence operatives who had assumed new identities after Endor would be activated through coded messages hidden in art exhibitions and cultural exchanges. Sleeper agents who had spent years building respectable lives as merchants, academics, and civil servants would receive seemingly innocent communications that would trigger long-dormant programming. But Thrawn's most valuable allies would not be professional spies or military officers. They would be individuals whose personal experiences had left them disillusioned with the New Republic's promises of justice and prosperity. War veterans who felt abandoned by the government they had served. Business owners whose enterprises had been destroyed by New Republic policies. Families who had lost loved ones to criminal organizations that flourished in the power vacuum left by the Empire's collapse. These people would not be recruited through coercion or bribery, but through careful appeals to their wounded pride and frustrated ambitions. Thrawn understood that the most effective agents were those who believed they were serving a righteous cause, and the New Republic had provided him with countless potential converts through its own failures and shortcomings. The Grand Admiral's personal quarters reflected his methodical approach to this recruitment process. Detailed psychological profiles covered one wall, each documenting a potential asset's background, motivations, and vulnerabilities. Another wall displayed a three-dimensional tactical map of the galaxy, with colored lights indicating the current status of various operations. The map resembled a work of abstract art, its shifting patterns revealing the hidden currents of power and influence that flowed beneath the New Republic's seemingly stable surface dot as night cycled into day. Aboard the Chimera, Thrawn began the process of transforming his theoretical understanding into practical action. Orders went out to carefully selected officers, each message coded in language that would appear routine to casual observers, but would convey precise tactical instructions to those who knew how to read between the lines. Supply requisitions were submitted for materials that would seem unremarkable individually but would combine to create devastating weapons when assembled by skilled technicians. The chess pieces were beginning to move across the galactic board, and the New Republic remained blissfully unaware that the game had already begun. The first signs of Thrawn's genius emerged in the Outer Rim, where New Republic patrol fleets began encountering Imperial forces that fought with an intelligence and coordination that defied all previous experience. Captain Wedge Antilles, commanding a squadron of X-Wing fighters on routine patrol near the Sluice Van shipyards, found himself facing TIE interceptors that seemed to anticipate his every tactical decision before he made it. The engagement began as expected, with Imperial forces emerging from hyperspace in what appeared to be a standard hit-and-run attack. Wedge deployed his squadrons according to textbook Rebel Alliance tactics, the same maneuvers that had proven successful against Imperial forces countless times during the Galactic Civil War. But as his pilots moved to intercept the enemy fighters, they discovered that their opponents had already repositioned to counter moves that hadn't yet been made. Imperial pilots flew with a precision that went beyond mere training or discipline. They moved as extensions of a single tactical mind, each fighter perfectly coordinated with its wingmates in patterns that maximized their effectiveness while exploiting weaknesses in New Republic formation flying that most commanders didn't even know existed. When Wedge ordered his pilots to execute a Corellian split, the classic maneuver that had saved countless rebel lives during the war, the Imperial interceptors were already in position to turn the tactic against itself. What troubled Wedge most was not the tactical brilliance of his opponents, but their restraint. The Imperial forces possessed clear superiority in both numbers and positioning, yet they withdrew after inflicting minimal casualties on his squadron. This was not the behavior of desperate Imperial remnants fighting for survival, but of a professional military force conducting what could only be described as a reconnaissance and force. Similar encounters were reported across a dozen systems, each following the same disturbing pattern. Imperial forces would engage New Republic patrols just long enough to test their responses, then disappear into hyperspace before reinforcements could arrive. The attack seemed random to casual observers, but careful analysis revealed a systematic probing of New Republic defensive capabilities that suggested the work of a brilliant strategic mind. Admiral Akbar, reviewing these reports in his office overlooking Coruscant's sprawling cityscape, felt the familiar weight of unease that had kept him alive through decades of warfare. The Mon Calamari's large eyes reflected the concern that was growing throughout New Republic High Command as they struggled to understand what they were facing. The empire they had fought and defeated had relied on overwhelming force and intimidation tactics. These new Imperial operations demonstrated a subtlety and sophistication that challenged every assumption about how their former enemies thought and fought. The intelligence reports that crossed Akbar's desk painted a picture of an enemy that understood the New Republic better than it understood itself. Imperial forces struck at precisely the moments when New Republic units were most vulnerable, exploiting gaps in patrol schedules that should have been impossible to predict. They targeted supply convoys carrying materials that most observers would consider strategically worthless. Yet the cumulative effect of these raids was beginning to strain the Republic's logistics network in ways that weren't immediately apparent. Most disturbing of all were the cultural artifacts that Imperial forces seemed to prioritize during their raids. Art museums, archaeological sites, and cultural centers were being systematically looted, their contents disappearing into the void of space with no apparent military purpose. New Republic intelligence analysts struggled to understand why an enemy force would waste resources on what appeared to be elaborate theft operations when they could be focusing on more conventional military targets. The truth, had they been able to perceive it, would have been far more unsettling than simple piracy. Each stolen artifact was being delivered to Thrawn's private collection aboard the Chimera, where the Grand Admiral studied them with the intensity of a scholar decoding ancient mysteries. A Twi'lek ceremonial mask revealed how that species approached group decision-making under stress. Corellian trading sculptures showed the psychological patterns that governed their merchant culture's approach to negotiation and conflict resolution. Through careful examination of these cultural treasures, Thrawn was building a comprehensive psychological profile of every major species within the New Republic. He understood that military intelligence could reveal an enemy's capabilities and intentions, but only cultural analysis could expose their fundamental weaknesses and blind spots. The New Republic's diversity, celebrated as its greatest strength, was actually a collection of exploitable vulnerabilities waiting to be manipulated by someone who understood how each member species thought and reacted under pressure. The Grand Admiral's collection had grown to encompass works from hundreds of worlds, each piece carefully cataloged and cross-referenced with tactical data from recent engagements. Thrawn would spend hours studying a single sculpture or painting, his red eyes tracking every detail as he absorbed the cultural programming encoded within the artwork. What others saw as beautiful objects, he perceived as weapons more devastating than any turbolaser battery. Captain Pelion, observing these study sessions from a respectful distance, began to comprehend the true scope of what Thrawn was attempting. This was not merely military planning, but a form of psychological warfare that operated on levels most beings couldn't even perceive. The Grand Admiral was learning to think like his enemies, understanding their cultural imperatives and emotional triggers with such precision that he could predict their responses to tactical situations they had never encountered before. The stolen artifacts were yielding insights that transformed theoretical knowledge into practical advantage. Thrawn discovered that Mon Calamari commanders, despite their reputation for tactical flexibility, followed predictable patterns when forced to make rapid decisions under stress. Their deep ocean origins had programmed them to seek protective cover when threatened, a reflex that could be exploited by enemies who understood how to create the right environmental pressures. Similarly, human pilots from core worlds exhibited a subtle but consistent tendency to favor maneuvers that preserved their technological advantages over their opponents. This preference could be turned against them by commanders who understood how to create tactical situations where technological superiority became a liability rather than an asset. Each discovery added another layer to Thrawn's understanding of his enemies, building toward a comprehensive tactical doctrine that would allow Imperial forces to defeat numerically superior opponents through pure strategic brilliance. The New Republic's initial assessment of the Imperial resurgence proved catastrophically wrong, though this miscalculation would not become apparent until much later. In the secure briefing rooms of Coruscant, military analysts studied the mounting reports of Imperial activity with the confidence of victors who had already proven their superiority over their enemies. The pattern of raids and probing attacks fit comfortably within their understanding of how desperate Imperial remnants might behave when driven to the galaxy's outer edges. General Carlist Riken, his weathered face bearing the scars of countless battles against the Empire, addressed the assembled intelligence officers with the authority of someone who had spent decades studying Imperial tactical doctrine. His analysis was thorough, professional, and completely incorrect. The empire they had defeated, he explained, had always relied on predictable strategies rooted in fear and overwhelming force. These new attacks, while more sophisticated than expected, still followed recognizable patterns that could be countered through conventional defensive measures. The consensus among New Republic leadership was that they were facing yet another Imperial warlord, albeit one with better training and resources than most. Admiral Akbar, despite his nagging sense of unease, found himself agreeing with assessments that painted the threat as manageable. The Empire's greatest weakness had always been its inability to adapt to changing circumstances, its rigid adherence to doctrine, even when that doctrine proved ineffective. There was no reason to believe that this new enemy would be fundamentally different from those they had already defeated, that this complacency was exactly what Thrawn had anticipated when he studied the psychological profiles of New Republic leadership. Human commanders, in particular, exhibited a cognitive bias that led them to interpret new information through the lens of past experience. They would see what they expected to see until the moment of revelation made denial impossible, and by then it would be too late to mount an effective defense. The first major engagement that should have shattered these illusions occurred in the brink system, where a New Republic convoy carrying medical supplies to refugee settlements encountered an Imperial force that seemed to materialize from empty space. The battle unfolded according to patterns that New Republic tacticians recognized and understood, with Imperial Star Destroyers advancing in the classic wedge formation, while TIE fighters screened their flanks against expected New Republic counterattacks. Commander Pash Kraken, leading the convoy's escort, deployed his forces according to standard defensive protocols that had been refined through years of successful engagements against Imperial forces. His frigates moved to intercept the Star Destroyers, while his fighter squadrons prepared to exploit the Empire's traditional weakness in small craft coordination. Everything proceeded exactly as his training and experience had taught him to expect, which should have been the first warning that something was terribly wrong. The Imperial attack developed with textbook precision, each phase unfolding at exactly the pace that New Republic defenders anticipated. When Kraken's fighters penetrated the TIE screen and began their attack runs on the Star Destroyers, they encountered defensive fire that was accurate, but not devastatingly so. The Imperial ships took damage at the expected rate, their shields failing and hull plating scorching under sustained assault from New Republic. Weapons. Victory seemed assured when the lead Star Destroyer began venting atmosphere from what appeared to be critical hits to its reactor housing. Kraken ordered his forces to concentrate fire on the damaged vessel, believing that its destruction would demoralize the remaining Imperial ships and force them to withdraw. This decision, tactically sound by all conventional measures, represented the moment when Thrawn's true plan began to unfold. The apparently damaged Star Destroyer was not crippled, but perfectly functional. Its vented atmosphere and flickering lights the result of carefully orchestrated deception. As New Republic forces concentrated their fire on what they believed to be a vulnerable target, 2 additional Imperial vessels dropped out of hyperspace at precisely calculated coordinates that placed them in perfect position to enfilade the Republic formation. The trap closed with mechanical precision, but even then the Imperial forces showed unusual restraint. Rather than pressing their advantage to complete annihilation, they inflicted enough damage to cripple the New Republic vessels before withdrawing, leaving behind survivors who could report on what had happened. This mercy, interpreted by New Republic analysts as evidence of Imperial weakness or supply shortages, was actually another demonstration of Thrawn's psychological manipulation. The survivors of the brink engagement returned to New Republic space with accounts that reinforced existing preconceptions about Imperial capabilities and intentions. Yes, the enemy had shown tactical skill and coordination, But they had also demonstrated the same fundamental limitations that had always characterized Imperial forces. They relied on deception and surprise because they lacked the strength for sustained combat. Their restraint suggested resource constraints that would make any extended campaign impossible. These conclusions, dutifully recorded in intelligence reports and disseminated throughout New Republic High Command, provided exactly the narrative that Thrawn wanted his enemies to believe. Every engagement was carefully calibrated to reinforce the illusion that the New Republic faced a competent but ultimately manageable threat. Imperial forces would demonstrate just enough capability to be taken seriously while concealing the true extent of their strategic planning and resource allocation. Mon Mothma, reviewing these reports in her private office, felt a mixture of concern and confidence that reflected the broader mood within New Republic leadership. The Empire clearly possessed more fight than anyone had expected, but it remained fundamentally the same enemy they had defeated through superior strategy and unwavering determination. The challenge would be greater than anticipated, but the outcome was not in doubt. This supreme confidence in their own tactical superiority would prove to be the New Republic's greatest vulnerability. Thrawn understood that proud enemies were often the easiest to defeat, their arrogance blinding them to dangers that humbler opponents would recognize immediately. Each small victory against Imperial forces reinforced the Republic's conviction that they understood their enemies' capabilities and limitations, making them progressively less capable of recognizing the true threat until it was far too late to respond effectively. The psychological trap was closing with the same precision as the tactical ones, and the New Republic remained blissfully unaware of their growing peril. The journey into the depths of Thrawn's true capabilities began when New Republic intelligence operatives started uncovering fragments of information that refused to fit into their comfortable assumptions about Imperial limitations. Deep within the classified archives of Coruscant, analysts discovered references to operations that should have been impossible given the Empire's supposed resource constraints. Supply convoys were being interdicted at locations that required precise knowledge of New Republic logistics networks. Imperial forces were appearing in systems that had never hosted significant Imperial presence, suggesting either a vast hidden fleet or capabilities that defied conventional understanding. Admiral Akbar found himself drawn into increasingly frequent strategy sessions as reports accumulated of Imperial activities that seemed to violate basic principles of military logistics. The enemy was operating across multiple sectors simultaneously, maintaining what appeared to be full-strength formations in regions separated by thousands of light years. Traditional analysis suggested that such operations would require a fleet larger than anything the Empire had possessed, even at the height of its power. Yet reconnaissance missions found no evidence of massive staging areas or construction facilities. First breakthrough came from an unexpected source when Talon Card, a smuggler who had inherited much of Jabba the Hutt's information network, contacted New Republic intelligence with data that painted a disturbing picture of Imperial capabilities. Card's organization had been tracking unusual patterns in black market trading, noting increased demand for specific types of artwork and cultural artifacts. The purchases were being made through intermediaries who paid premium prices for items that most collectors would consider interesting but not extraordinarily valuable. What made these transactions significant was their systematic nature. Someone was acquiring representative samples of artwork from virtually every species within the New Republic, focusing particularly on pieces that reflected cultural values and psychological patterns. The buyer showed sophisticated knowledge of anthropological significance, selecting works that revealed deep insights into how different species approached problem-solving and conflict resolution. Card's revelation forced New Republic analysts to reconsider their understanding of recent Imperial raids. The attacks on museums and cultural centers, previously dismissed as opportunistic looting, began to appear as components of a larger intelligence-gathering operation. Someone was building a comprehensive database of cultural information that could provide unprecedented insight into the psychological vulnerabilities of New Republic member species. The implications were staggering when fully comprehended. An enemy who understood the fundamental thought patterns of different species could predict their responses to tactical situations with near supernatural accuracy. Cultural programming that had evolved over millennia would become exploitable weaknesses in the hands of a commander who knew how to recognize and manipulate psychological triggers that operated below the level of conscious awareness. Luke Skywalker, meditating in the former Imperial Palace that now served as the New Republic's seat of government, felt disturbances in the Force that seemed to echo these disturbing discoveries. His visions were fragmented and difficult to interpret, filled with images of red eyes studying ancient artifacts, while starships moved across star charts like pieces in some vast game of strategy. The presence behind these visions possessed an intelligence that was both alien and coldly analytical, calculating possibilities and probabilities with mechanical precision. The Force visions revealed something else that chilled Luke to his core. He was not the only Force-sensitive being involved in these unfolding events. Somewhere in the galaxy, another presence was stirring, one that felt simultaneously familiar and utterly wrong. This shadow figure seemed to know things about the Jedi that had been lost with the destruction of the Old Order, possessing knowledge that should have died with the Emperor on the second Death Star. Princess Leia, now serving as Chief of State for the New Republic, found her diplomatic responsibilities increasingly complicated by reports of internal tensions that seemed to emerge from nowhere and escalate with disturbing rapidity. Bothan delegates were questioning Mon Calamari military decisions with unusual vehemence. Corellian senators were raising concerns about core world policies that had previously enjoyed broad support. Each dispute appeared to have legitimate foundations, yet the timing and intensity suggested outside manipulation. The political fractures were appearing along precisely the cultural lines that Thrawn had been studying through his collection of stolen artifacts. Species that had cooperated effectively during the rebellion were suddenly unable to find common ground on issues that should have been relatively straightforward. Ancient prejudices and cultural misunderstandings were surfacing in debates where they had no apparent relevance, poisoning discussions that should have focused on practical solutions to shared problems. Leia's training in the Force, though limited compared to Luke's, allowed her to sense the artificial nature of these conflicts. The anger and suspicion that was driving senators and delegates to increasingly extreme positions felt manufactured rather than organic, as if someone was deliberately feeding information and suggestions designed to exploit cultural blind spots and historical grievances. The scope of the manipulation became clearer when New Republic counterintelligence operatives began tracing the sources of inflammatory information that was circulating through diplomatic channels. Anonymous reports about military incompetence, economic discrimination, and political favoritism were being disseminated through networks that appeared to operate with professional sophistication. The sources were always indirect, the information always contained enough truth to be credible, and the timing was always calculated for maximum disruptive impact. What emerged from this investigation was evidence of an intelligence operation that surpassed anything the Empire had previously attempted. Rather than relying on crude propaganda or direct subversion, this campaign used psychological manipulation techniques that turned the New Republic's own virtues against itself. Democratic debate became factional warfare. Cultural diversity became mutual suspicion. The very qualities that had enabled the rebellion to unite against tyranny were being weaponized by an enemy who understood their psychological foundations better than the Republic's own leaders did. The realization that they were facing an opponent of unprecedented sophistication sent shockwaves through New Republic High Command. This was not another Imperial warlords seeking to carve out a personal fiefdom, but a strategic genius who had studied their civilization with scientific precision and was methodically dismantling it from within. The empire they thought they understood had been replaced by something far more dangerous, an enemy who fought not with overwhelming force, but with perfect knowledge of their weaknesses. As this truth began to penetrate the highest levels of government, a new sense of urgency gripped the new Republic leadership, though they still had no conception of the true identity or capabilities of their adversary. The ancient patterns that governed galactic civilization had repeated themselves countless times throughout history, though few beings possessed the perspective to recognize these cycles across the vast spans of time that separated one era from another. In the deepest archives of the Jedi Temple, now serving as Luke Skywalker's research facility, dusty holocrons contained fragments of wisdom from civilizations that had risen and fallen millennia before the Republic's founding. These records spoke of recurring themes that echoed across the ages: the rise of order from chaos, the corruption of power, the inevitable collapse that preceded renewal. Luke found himself drawn to these ancient teachings as his meditations continued, to be disturbed by visions of the mysterious presence that seemed to orchestrate events from the shadows. The Force visions had grown more vivid and coherent, revealing glimpses of a figure whose knowledge of the Jedi arts appeared to rival that of the greatest masters in the Order's history. This being spoke of the Force not with the reverence that Luke had learned from Obi-Wan and Yoda, but with the clinical detachment of someone who had studied its principles as abstract phenomena to be manipulated rather than served. The holocron of Master Vodosios Baz, one of the few that had survived the temple's desecration during the Purge, contained warnings about fallen Jedi who had sought to use the Force as a tool for imposing their will upon the galaxy. These dark masters had believed that their superior understanding of the Force's nature gave them the right to guide lesser beings toward what they perceived as optimal outcomes. Their arrogance had inevitably led to corruption and destruction, yet each generation seemed destined to produce individuals who believed they could succeed where their predecessors had failed. The parallels between these ancient warnings and Luke's current visions were too precise to be coincidental. Somewhere in the galaxy, a Force-sensitive being was applying Jedi techniques toward ends that the Order would have considered abhorrent. This individual possessed training that suggested formal instruction in the Jedi arts, yet their methods reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the Force's true nature. They sought to control rather than serve, to impose order rather than preserve balance. As Luke delved deeper into the holocron archives, he discovered references to a phenomenon that the ancient Jedi had termed echo effects, moments when the patterns of one historical period would resurface in dramatically different contexts. The rise and fall of the Sith Empire, the corruption of the Old Republic, the emergence of the Galactic Empire under Palpatine, all followed variations of the same fundamental cycle. Each iteration brought new technologies and different personalities, but the underlying dynamics remained remarkably consistent. The current situation appeared to represent another such echo, with Imperial remnants following patterns that had been established thousands of years earlier. The mysterious commander who was orchestrating these events seemed to understand these historical precedents with scholarly precision, using ancient strategies adapted to contemporary circumstances. This was not mere military planning, but a form of historical analysis that treated the present as another chapter in an ongoing narrative that had been unfolding since the dawn of galactic civilization. Meanwhile, in the unknown regions, Thrawn stood before a holographic display that showed the current political situation within New Republic space with crystalline clarity. The cultural artifacts in his collection had yielded insights that allowed him to predict factional disputes with remarkable accuracy. But his true understanding came from studying the historical patterns that governed how democratic societies responded to external pressure. The New Republic was following a trajectory that had been traced by dozens of similar governments throughout galactic history. Initial unity born of shared struggle would gradually fragment as immediate threats receded and long-term governance challenges emerged. Different member species would begin to prioritize their own interests over collective well-being, creating opportunities for manipulation by enemies who understood these psychological patterns. What made the current situation particularly favorable for Imperial resurgence was the New Republic's naive belief in its own moral superiority. The rebellion had defined itself in opposition to Imperial tyranny, creating an identity that depended on viewing their former enemies as fundamentally different from themselves. This ideological framework made it difficult for Republic leaders to recognize that they were vulnerable to the same psychological pressures that had enabled the Empire's original rise to power. Thrawn's study of ancient Kaiser's military philosophy had taught him that the most effective strategies were those that allowed enemies to defeat themselves through their own inherent contradictions. The New Republic's greatest strength, its commitment to democratic governance and species equality, was also its most exploitable weakness when placed under the right kinds of pressure. Cultural diversity became factional discord when trust broke down. Democratic debate became paralysis when consensus became impossible to achieve. The Grand Admiral's collection now included artifacts from ancient civilizations that had faced similar challenges, their artistic traditions revealing how different species had attempted to balance individual freedom with collective security. The patterns were remarkably consistent across vastly different technological and cultural contexts, suggesting that these were fundamental psychological dynamics rather than historically specific phenomena. A Corellian sculpture from the pre-Republic era showed how that world's merchant culture had approached the problem of maintaining unity while preserving individual initiative. The flowing lines and interconnected forms revealed a society that valued personal achievement but understood its dependence on larger networks of cooperation. This cultural programming made Corellians natural traders and diplomats, but it also made them vulnerable to strategies that disrupted their carefully maintained balance between competition and collaboration. Similar insights emerged from artifacts representing virtually every major species within the New Republic. Each culture had evolved specific approaches to managing internal conflict and external threats, creating psychological patterns that could be exploited by enemies who possessed sufficient understanding of their historical development. The New Republic's diversity, celebrated as evidence of its moral evolution beyond imperial bigotry, was actually a collection of distinct vulnerabilities waiting to be manipulated by a strategist who understood how each member species thought and reacted under stress. The ancient patterns were reasserting themselves with mechanical precision, and the New Republic remained blind to the historical forces that were reshaping their destiny according to laws as predictable as those governing planetary motion. The discovery that shattered every assumption about the nature of their enemy came not through military intelligence or diplomatic channels, but through the careful analysis of seemingly unrelated incidents that had been occurring across New Republic space for months. Intelligence analyst Winter Chelshu, whose perfect memory had made her invaluable to the rebellion during the darkest days of the war, noticed patterns in the data that others had dismissed as coincidental. The breakthrough began when Winter cross-referenced the timing of political disputes within the New Republic Senate with the movement patterns of Imperial forces in the Outer Rim. What emerged was a correlation so precise that it could not possibly be accidental. Every major factional conflict within the government had been preceded by Imperial raids that targeted specific cultural sites belonging to the species that would later become involved in political disputes. The implications were staggering. When fully understood, the Imperial forces were not simply stealing artwork for fun or decoration, but were using cultural analysis to predict and manipulate political behavior within the New Republic. Someone possessed sufficient understanding of interspecies psychology to orchestrate conflicts by exploiting cultural blind spots and historical grievances that most beings were not even consciously aware of possessing. Winter's analysis revealed the sophisticated nature of the manipulation with disturbing clarity. Bothan art theft had preceded increased Bothan paranoia about Mon Calamari military leadership. Corellian cultural raids had coincided with growing Corellian concerns about core world economic policies. The pattern extended across dozens of species and hundreds of incidents, creating a web of psychological manipulation that encompassed virtually every aspect of New Republic governance. The revelation forced a complete reassessment of recent Imperial activities throughout the galaxy. Military engagements that had appeared to be conventional raids or probing attacks were revealed as components of a vast intelligence-gathering operation designed to test New Republic responses under carefully controlled conditions. The enemy was not simply fighting the New Republic, but studying it with scientific precision, learning how different species and cultures reacted to various forms of pressure. Admiral Akbar, reviewing Winter's findings in emergency session with the New Republic High Command, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the climate control systems in the briefing room. The tactical genius they were facing possessed capabilities that transcended conventional military planning, representing a form of warfare that attacked the psychological foundations of their civilization rather than simply its military forces. Enemies' restraint during previous engagements now appeared in an entirely different light. Imperial forces had demonstrated mercy not from weakness or supply constraints, but because their primary objective was intelligence gathering rather than destruction. Each surviving New Republic soldier carried back information about their own tactical responses and psychological reactions, data that could be analyzed and used to predict future behavior with increasing accuracy. Luke Skywalker's Force visions began to coalesce around these discoveries, revealing fragments of the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of careful deception. The presence he had sensed possessed knowledge that extended far beyond military tactics, encompassing deep understanding of cultural psychology and historical patterns that most beings could not perceive. This enemy studied civilizations, ways scientists studied natural phenomena, seeking to understand the underlying laws that govern their behavior. The vision showed Luke glimpses of a vast collection of cultural artifacts, each piece carefully cataloged and analyzed for the insights it provided into the species that had created it. The figure examining these treasures moved with the patience of someone who understood that true knowledge required careful observation and methodical analysis. This was not the crude approach of previous Imperial commanders who had relied on fear and intimidation, but the work of a scholar whose academic pursuits had been weaponized in service of strategic objectives. What disturbed Luke most was the clinical detachment with which this enemy viewed the suffering caused by their manipulations. Political conflicts that tore apart friendships and destroyed trust between former allies were simply data points in a larger analysis of how democratic societies responded to internal pressure. The psychological pain inflicted on individuals caught in these manufactured disputes was irrelevant compared to the strategic insights gained through careful observation of their reactions. The Force visions revealed another unsettling truth about the mysterious presence that seemed to guide Imperial operations from the shadows. This being possessed formal training in techniques that resembled Jedi arts, but had been twisted toward purposes that the Order would have found abhorrent. The dark side of the Force was being used not for personal power or emotional gratification, but as a tool for imposing order on a galaxy that this individual believed was too chaotic to govern itself effectively. Princess Leia, coordinating the New Republic's response to these discoveries, found herself facing political challenges that seemed designed to test every weakness that Winter's analysis had identified. Senate debates that should have focused on practical responses to the Imperial threat instead devolved into cultural disputes and historical grievances that appeared from nowhere and escalated with unnatural intensity. The psychological manipulation was occurring in real time, with new inflammatory information appearing in diplomatic channels whenever productive discussion seemed possible. Someone possessed detailed knowledge of individual senators' cultural backgrounds and personal motivations, using this information to craft provocations that would trigger predictable responses from specific species and personality types. The scope of the intelligence operation became clear when counterintelligence experts traced the sources of this manipulative information. The data networks being used to spread discord operated with professional sophistication that suggested the work of Imperial intelligence operatives who had been planning these operations for years. Sleeper agents embedded throughout New Republic society were being activated through coded communications that appeared to be routine cultural exchanges or academic discussions. Realization that they had been infiltrated so thoroughly sent shockwaves through the New Republic leadership. The democratic openness that they had celebrated as proof of their moral superiority over the Empire had been systematically exploited by enemies who understood their psychological vulnerabilities better than they understood themselves. Their greatest virtues had become weapons in the hands of an adversary whose patience and analytical capabilities exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The enemy they faced possessed the strategic vision to plan operations across multiple years and the cultural knowledge necessary to predict their responses with disturbing accuracy. The threads of conspiracy that had been carefully woven across course years of patient planning began to reveal their true pattern as New Republic investigators delved deeper into the network of manipulation that had been operating beneath their notice. What they discovered was not simply a military campaign, but a comprehensive strategy for psychological warfare that extended back to the earliest days following the Battle of Endor. The enemy had been studying and manipulating them from the moment of their greatest triumph, turning their victory celebration into the beginning of their own systematic undoing. Captain Gilad Pellaeon stood in Thrawn's private gallery aboard the Chimera, watching the Grand Admiral examine a recently acquired piece of Alderaanian crystal, sculpture that had somehow survived the planet's destruction. The artifact's delicate structure caught the starlight filtering through the viewport, creating patterns of refracted light that seemed to shift and change as Thrawn moved around it. To Pellaeon, it was simply a beautiful remnant of a lost civilization. To Thrawn, it was a window into the psychological architecture that had produced leaders like Bail Organa and his adopted daughter, Leia. The Grand Admiral's analysis of the sculpture revealed insights that demonstrated the breathtaking scope of his strategic vision. Alderaanian culture had valued peace and diplomatic solutions above military might, creating a philosophical framework that made their leaders predictably vulnerable to certain forms of psychological pressure. Princess Leia had inherited these cultural imperatives despite her adoption, manifesting Alderaanian decision-making patterns even when logic suggested more aggressive approaches would be more effective. This understanding allowed Thrawn to predict with remarkable accuracy how Leia would respond to specific political crises within the New Republic. Her Alderaanian programming would compel her to seek consensus and diplomatic solutions, even when faced with enemies who viewed such approaches as weakness to be exploited. The cultural artifacts in Thrawn's collection had taught him that species-specific psychological patterns were incredibly persistent, surviving even dramatic changes in environment and circumstances. The revelation of how thoroughly the New Republic had been penetrated emerged through painstaking analysis of communication networks that had appeared to operate normally for years. Hidden within routine diplomatic correspondence and cultural exchanges were coded messages that had been coordinating Imperial intelligence operations across dozens of star systems. The network's sophistication suggested planning that had begun during the final years of the Empire, with operatives positioned to exploit the chaos that would follow Palpatine's death. Luke Skywalker's investigations into the Force-sensitive presence that haunted his visions led him to archives that had been sealed since the destruction of the old Jedi Temple. Ancient recordings spoke of dark Jedi who had sought to use the Force not for personal power, but for what they perceived as the greater good of galactic civilization. These fallen masters had believed that their superior understanding of the Force gave them the right to guide lesser beings toward optimal outcomes, justifying any amount of suffering in service of their grand designs. The parallels to Luke's current visions were undeniable. Somewhere in the galaxy, a being with formal Jedi training was applying these ancient philosophies to contemporary circumstances, using the Force to manipulate events on a galactic scale. This individual possessed patience that spanned years and strategic vision that encompassed entire civilizations, viewing the current conflict not as a simple military campaign but as an opportunity to reshape galactic society according to their own vision of optimal order. The psychological profile that emerged from these investigations painted a picture of an enemy whose capabilities transcended anything the New Republic had previously encountered. This was not another power-hungry warlord seeking personal aggrandizement, but a strategic genius who viewed the galaxy as a vast laboratory for testing theories about social organization and species psychology. Every manipulation and manufactured crisis served multiple purposes, generating data about New Republic responses while simultaneously weakening their capacity for effective governance. Admiral Akbar's strategic analysis revealed the true scope of the threat they were facing. The Imperial forces operating under this mysterious commander possessed capabilities that suggested access to resources that should not have existed. Their intelligence networks were too comprehensive, their coordination too precise, their understanding of New Republic weaknesses too complete to be explained by conventional espionage or military planning. The evidence pointed toward the existence of a hidden infrastructure that had been developing in secret for years, possibly since before the Battle of Endor. The shadowy organization possessed technological capabilities that rivaled those of the Empire at its height, along with strategic leadership that surpassed anything the Imperial military had previously demonstrated. They were not fighting to restore the old Empire, but to create something entirely new, a form of galactic governance that would eliminate the chaos and inefficiency they perceived in democratic systems. Winter's analysis of the manipulation campaigns revealed their systematic nature with disturbing clarity. Every major political crisis within the New Republic had been carefully orchestrated to test specific hypotheses about how democratic societies responded to internal pressure. The results of each experiment informed the design of subsequent operations, creating a feedback loop that allowed the enemy to refine their understanding of New Republic psychology with each iteration. The personal dimension of these revelations struck the New Republic leadership with particular force. Their private conversations, their individual psychological profiles, their personal relationships and family histories had all been studied and cataloged by enemies who understood their motivations better than they understood themselves. Democratic transparency that they had celebrated as evidence of their moral evolution had been systematically exploited by adversaries who viewed such openness as strategic vulnerability rather than ethical strength. Princess Leia found herself questioning not only her political decisions, but her most fundamental assumptions about leadership and governance. If her responses to crises had been predicted and manipulated by enemies who understood her cultural programming, how could she trust any of her instincts about what was best for the New Republic? The psychological warfare being waged against them was designed not simply to defeat their military forces, but to undermine their confidence in their own judgment and decision-making abilities. The true genius of their enemy's strategy was becoming apparent. They were being defeated not through superior firepower, but through perfect knowledge of their own weaknesses and blind spots. The convergence of knowledge that would reshape the New Republic's understanding of their predicament began in the most unlikely of places, deep within the information networks that Talon Karrde had inherited from the galaxy's criminal underworld. The smuggler chief had built his organization on the principle that information was more valuable than any cargo, creating a web of contacts that extended into every corner of civilized space. It was through these channels that fragments of truth began to coalesce into a coherent picture of the enemy they were truly facing. Karrde's meeting with New Republic intelligence took place in a nondescript warehouse on Coruscant's lower levels, far from the gleaming towers where senators debated the fate of worlds. The atmosphere was thick with industrial vapors and the constant hum of urban machinery, providing cover for conversations that could not be conducted through official channels. What Karrde revealed in that dimly lit space would fundamentally alter how the Republic understood the nature of warfare itself. The smugglers' organization had been tracking unusual patterns in the black market trade for months, noting systematic purchases of cultural artifacts that followed no conventional collecting logic. The buyers operated through multiple layers of intermediaries, paying premium prices for items that most dealers would consider interesting but not extraordinarily valuable. What made these transactions significant was their comprehensive nature and the specialized knowledge they demonstrated about anthropological significance. Karrde's data revealed a purchasing pattern that encompassed representative samples of artwork from virtually every species within the New Republic, with particular emphasis on pieces that reflected deep cultural values and psychological patterns. The buyers showed sophisticated understanding of how art revealed the thought processes of its creators, selecting works that provided maximum insight into species-specific approaches to problem-solving and conflict resolution. The implications became clear when this information was cross-referenced with military intelligence about recent Imperial operations. The systematic art acquisition was not random collecting, but strategic intelligence gathering on an unprecedented scale. Someone was building a comprehensive psychological profile of New Republic member species, using cultural analysis to identify exploitable weaknesses in their decision-making processes. Luke Skywalker's presence at the meeting brought another dimension to the discussion as he shared details of his Force visions that had previously seemed too fragmented to be useful. The mysterious presence he had been sensing possessed formal training in Jedi techniques, but applied them toward ends that violated every principle of the Order. This individual used meditation and Force sensitivity not to achieve harmony with the living Force, but to manipulate events according to predetermined strategic objectives. The Force visions revealed glimpses of a vast collection housed aboard what appeared to be an Imperial Star Destroyer, with artifacts arranged not for aesthetic appreciation but for analytical study. The figure examining these treasures moved with the patience of a scholar whose academic pursuits had been weaponized in service of military objectives. Each piece was cataloged and cross-referenced with tactical data, creating a database of cultural information that provided unprecedented insight into the cultural information to the psychological vulnerabilities of different species. Admiral Akbar contributed tactical analysis that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of their enemy's capabilities. The Imperial forces operating throughout the galaxy demonstrated coordination and strategic planning that suggested a single commanding intelligence of extraordinary capability. Their operations spanned multiple sectors simultaneously, maintaining what appeared to be full-strength formations in regions separated by thousands of light years without any apparent strain on their logistics networks. The evidence pointed toward technological capabilities that should not have existed, given the Empire's supposed defeat and fragmentation. The Imperial remnants were not simply surviving on cached supplies and hidden resources, but were actively manufacturing new equipment and recruiting personnel at rates that defied conventional analysis. This suggested access to industrial infrastructure and population bases that had somehow remained hidden from New Republic intelligence services. Winter's contribution to the discussion involved detailed analysis of the psychological manipulation campaigns that had been targeting New Republic governance for months. The operations demonstrated understanding of individual senators, cultural backgrounds, and personal motivations that went far beyond anything conventional intelligence gathering could provide. Someone possessed detailed psychological profiles of key leadership figures, using this information to craft provocations that would trigger predictable responses from specific personality types. The manipulation was occurring in real time, with new inflammatory information appearing in diplomatic channels whenever productive discussion seemed possible. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, suggesting that the enemy possessed comprehensive surveillance capabilities within the highest levels of New Republic government. They were not simply predicting political responses but actively shaping them through carefully orchestrated information warfare. Mara Jade's unexpected appearance at the meeting brought perspective from someone who had served the Empire's intelligence apparatus at its highest levels. As the Emperor's hand, she had possessed access to operational methods and strategic resources that most Imperial officers never knew existed. Her analysis of the current situation revealed capabilities that exceeded even what she had witnessed during the Empire's Golden Age. The enemy they were facing possessed institutional knowledge that should have died with Palpatine, along with resources that suggested planning that had begun years before the Battle of Endor. The operations demonstrated patience and strategic vision that transcended normal military planning, representing a form of warfare that treated the entire galaxy as a laboratory for testing theories about social organization and species psychology. The most disturbing revelation emerged when these various streams of information were synthesized into a coherent assessment of the threat. The New Republic was not facing another Imperial warlord seeking to carve out a personal fiefdom, but a strategic genius who understood their civilization better than they understood themselves. This enemy had studied democratic societies with scientific precision, identifying psychological patterns and structural weaknesses that could be exploited through carefully orchestrated campaigns of manipulation and subversion. The gathering in that warehouse represented a turning point in the New Republic's understanding of their predicament. They were engaged in a conflict that transcended conventional warfare, facing an adversary whose weapons were knowledge and psychological manipulation rather than turbolasers and star destroyers. The weight of accumulated knowledge had begun to press upon the New Republic leadership like a physical force, transforming their understanding of reality in ways that made previous certainties seem naive and dangerous. In the secure briefing rooms of Coruscant, military commanders and political leaders gathered around holographic displays that showed the true scope of the threat they were facing, their faces reflecting the gravity of revelations that challenged every assumption about the nature of their enemy and their own vulnerabilities. Admiral Akbar stood before the assembled leaders, his large eyes reflecting the blue glow of tactical displays that painted a picture more disturbing than any conventional military assessment. The Imperial forces they had been tracking across the galaxy were not operating as separate units, but as components of a single, coordinated campaign that spanned multiple years and encompassed objectives that went far beyond simple territorial conquest. The enemy possessed strategic patience that transcended normal military planning, demonstrating willingness to sacrifice immediate tactical advantages for long-term psychological effects. The revelation that their democratic processes had been systematically infiltrated and manipulated sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Senators who had prided themselves on their independence of thought discovered that their most passionate convictions had been shaped by carefully crafted information campaigns designed to exploit their species-specific psychological vulnerabilities. The debates that had consumed their attention for months were revealed as elaborate distractions, keeping them focused on manufactured controversies while their real enemy prepared operations that would threaten the very foundations of their civilization. Luke Skywalker found his Force abilities increasingly disturbed by visions that seemed to emanate from multiple sources simultaneously. The dark presence he had been sensing was not working alone, but was connected to other Force-sensitive individuals whose combined influence created disturbances that rippled across the galaxy like waves from some vast stone dropped into still water. These beings possessed training in Jedi techniques, but had twisted those teachings toward purposes that perverted everything the Order had stood for. The most troubling aspect of these visions was their clarity and coherence, suggesting that the dark side users involved possessed formal instruction in meditation and Force projection techniques. They were not crude practitioners driven by emotion and instinct, but trained individuals who applied their abilities with clinical precision toward predetermined objectives. Their use of the Force resembled scientific methodology more than the passionate embrace of power that had characterized previous dark side adherents. Princess Leia's attempts to maintain political unity within the New Republic were being systematically undermined by conflicts that appeared to emerge from nowhere and escalate with unnatural intensity. Species that had cooperated effectively during the rebellion were suddenly unable to find common ground on issues that should have been relatively straightforward. Ancient prejudices and cultural misunderstandings were surfacing in debates where they had no apparent relevance, poisoning discussions that should have focused on practical responses to shared threats. The psychological manipulation was occurring at levels that most beings could not consciously perceive, exploiting cultural programming that had evolved over millennia of species development. The enemy understood that democratic societies were particularly vulnerable to certain forms of internal pressure, their openness and commitment to peaceful resolution, making them predictably susceptible to manufactured controversies that played upon deep-seated cultural anxieties. Winter's analysis revealed the systematic nature of these operations with disturbing precision. Every major political crisis within the New Republic had been preceded by information campaigns that targeted specific cultural groups with messages designed to trigger predictable emotional responses. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, suggesting comprehensive surveillance and real-time adjustment of psychological pressure based on observed reactions. The intelligence networks being used to spread discord operated with professional sophistication that indicated the involvement of Imperial intelligence operatives who had been planning these operations for years. Sleeper agents embedded throughout New Republic society were being activated through coded communications that appeared to be routine cultural exchanges or academic discussions, their true purpose hidden beneath layers of seemingly innocent interaction. Captain Pelion, monitoring these developments from the bridge of the Chimera, watched Thrawn orchestrate the final phases of preparation with the same methodical precision that had characterized every aspect of the campaign. The Grand Admiral's private collection had grown to encompass artifacts from hundreds of worlds, each piece carefully studied and cataloged for the insights it provided into the psychological patterns of different species and cultures. The scope of Thrawn's vision was becoming apparent to those who worked closest with him. This was not simply a military campaign, but a comprehensive strategy for reshaping galactic civilization according to principles derived from careful study of historical patterns and cultural psychology. The New Republic represented everything that Thrawn considered inefficient and chaotic about democratic governance. Its diversity and commitment to individual freedom, creating vulnerabilities that a properly organized enemy could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The Force-sensitive ally that Thrawn had acquired during his time in the unknown regions possessed knowledge that should have died with the destruction of the Jedi Order. This individual understood techniques for manipulating large-scale events through careful application of Force abilities, using meditation and prescience to coordinate operations across vast distances and time spans. Their collaboration represented a fusion of tactical genius with supernatural capabilities that created possibilities for warfare that transcended conventional military planning. The final pieces of the grand strategy were falling into place with mechanical precision, each element carefully timed to maximize psychological impact, while minimizing the enemy's ability to mount effective resistance. The New Republic's greatest strengths were being systematically turned against them, their democratic institutions becoming weapons in the hands of enemies who understood their fundamental nature better than their own leaders did. The calm before. The storm had arrived, and across the galaxy, forces that had been building in shadow for years were preparing to emerge into the light of open conflict. The New Republic remained largely unaware of the true scope of what was coming. Their attention focused on immediate political crises while their real enemy, prepared to strike at the very heart of their civilization, that the moment of ultimate revelation arrived not with the thunder of turbolaser batteries or the screaming descent of starfighters, but in the quiet solitude of a New Republic intelligence briefing room where the final pieces of an impossible puzzle finally clicked into place. Admiral Akbar stood before a holographic display that showed the true face of their enemy for the first time, his expression reflecting the mixture of awe and horror that comes with understanding how completely one has been outmaneuvered by a superior intellect. The being whose red eyes stared back at them from the intelligence reports was unlike any Imperial officer they had previously encountered. Grand Admiral Thrawn of the Kaiser species represented a form of military genius that transcended conventional strategic planning, combining alien perspectives with an understanding of galactic psychology that bordered on the supernatural. His blue skin and glowing crimson gaze marked him as non-human, a fact that made his rise through the xenophobic Imperial hierarchy all the more remarkable and disturbing. Luke Skywalker felt the Force ripple with recognition as he gazed upon Thrawn's image, the mysterious presence from his visions finally acquiring a face and identity. But the Grand Admiral was not the dark Force user who had been haunting his meditations. That shadow belonged to another figure whose existence represented an even more fundamental threat to everything Luke understood about the nature of the Force and the legacy of the Jedi Order. The revelation of Thrawn's tactical methodology sent shockwaves through the assembled leadership as they comprehended the true scope of the intelligence operation that had been conducted against them. The Grand Admiral's private collection of cultural artifacts was not the hobby of an aesthetically inclined military officer, but a comprehensive database of psychological warfare intelligence, gathered through years of systematic study. Every stolen sculpture and purloined painting had been analyzed for the insights it provided into the thought patterns and decision-making processes of different species. What made this approach to warfare truly revolutionary was its basis in cultural anthropology rather than military history. Where other commanders studied past battles and tactical manuals, Thrawn had immersed himself in the artistic expressions of his enemies, learning to read their psychological blueprints through careful analysis of their creative output. He understood that wars were won not through superior firepower, but through perfect knowledge of how one's opponents would react under specific forms of pressure. The implications of this discovery transformed every previous engagement with Imperial forces into a new and terrifying light. The restraint that Imperial units had shown during various battles was revealed as strategic intelligence, gathering rather than mercy or resource limitations. Every surviving New Republic soldier had carried back information about their own tactical responses and psychological reactions, data that Thrawn could analyze and use to predict future behavior with increasing accuracy. Princess Leia's political difficulties within the New Republic Senate now appeared as components of a master plan that had been orchestrated with scientific precision. The factional disputes and cultural conflicts that had consumed so much of her attention were not organic political developments, but carefully manufactured crises designed to test specific hypotheses about how democratic societies responded to internal pressure. Her own responses had been predicted and manipulated by an enemy who understood her Alderaanian cultural programming better than she understood it herself. The scope of Thrawn's strategic vision became apparent as intelligence analysts traced the connections between seemingly unrelated events across multiple star systems. Imperial raids that had appeared to be opportunistic attacks were revealed as components of a vast intelligence-gathering operation designed to map the psychological landscape of New Republic civilization. The Grand Admiral had been studying them the way a scientist might study laboratory specimens, cataloging their responses to various stimuli in order to develop comprehensive theories about their behavior. But Thrawn's genius alone could not account for all the phenomena that New Republic investigators had observed. The coordination of operations across vast distances, the seemingly supernatural accuracy of predictions about political developments, the ability to manipulate events in ways that suggested knowledge of future outcomes, all pointed toward capabilities that transcended conventional military planning. The truth, when it finally emerged, struck at the very heart of Luke's understanding of the Force and the Jedi legacy. Thrawn had acquired an ally whose existence challenged everything the New Republic thought it knew about the destruction of the old Jedi Order. Somewhere in the galaxy, a being with formal training in Jedi techniques was applying those abilities toward ends that perverted everything the Order had stood for. This dark Force user possessed knowledge that should have died with the Emperor, understanding of Jedi meditation and prescience techniques that enabled him to coordinate operations across impossible distances and time spans. But unlike previous dark side adherents who had been driven by passion and personal ambition, this individual applied Force abilities with clinical detachment toward what he perceived as the greater good of galactic civilization. The revelation that struck deepest was the identity of this fallen Jedi, a name that carried echoes of tragedy and madness that reached back to the darkest days of the Clone Wars. Joruus C'baoth, once a respected Jedi Master who had served the Republic with distinction, had somehow survived the Purge and spent decades in isolation, his sanity eroded by solitude and his understanding of the Force twisted beyond recognition. C'baoth's collaboration with Thrawn represented a fusion of tactical genius with supernatural capabilities that created possibilities for warfare that had never before been attempted. The Mad Jedi's ability to coordinate the thoughts and actions of multiple individuals through Force manipulation provided Thrawn with a command and control system that operated at the speed of thought rather than the limitations of conventional communication networks. The psychological profiles that had been developed of key New Republic leaders were not based solely on cultural analysis, but had been enhanced through Force-based observation of their emotional states and decision-making processes. C'baoth could sense the psychological pressures that would be most effective against specific individuals, providing Thrawn with intelligence that no conventional espionage network could match. The whisper that had haunted the galaxy's dreams was growing into a storm that would test every assumption about the nature of power, leadership, and the price of freedom in a universe where knowledge itself had become the ultimate weapon. The final confrontation between the New Republic and Grand Admiral Thrawn unfolded not as a single decisive battle, but as a cascade of interconnected crises that tested every weakness the Kaiser's strategist had identified during his years of patient observation. The culmination came at the Bilbringi shipyards, where the fate of democracy itself would be decided through a contest between two fundamentally different philosophies of governance and warfare. Luke Skywalker stood on the bridge of a New Republic cruiser, his lightsaber dormant at his side as he contemplated the true nature of the enemy they faced. The dark presence that had haunted his visions was no longer a mystery, but a tragic figure whose fall from grace represented one of the greatest failures in Jedi history. Joru Iscarbaeoth had once been a respected master whose wisdom had guided the Republic through some of its darkest hours. But decades of isolation and madness had transformed him into something that perverted everything the Force was meant to represent. The Mad Jedi's collaboration with Thrawn had created a command structure that operated beyond the limitations of conventional military organization. Iscarbaeoth's ability to coordinate the thoughts and actions of multiple individuals through force manipulation provided the Grand Admiral with instantaneous communication across vast distances, allowing Imperial forces to respond to changing battlefield conditions with supernatural coordination. But Luke understood that Iscarbaeoth's madness was also Thrawn's greatest vulnerability. The fallen Jedi's desire to reshape the galaxy, according to his own twisted vision of order, conflicted with the Grand Admiral's more subtle approach to conquest. Their alliance was built on mutual necessity rather than shared ideals, creating fault lines that could be exploited by enemies who understood the psychological dynamics involved. Princess Leia's role in the final confrontation extended far beyond her military responsibilities as she worked to hold together a new republic that was fracturing under the psychological pressure of Thrawn's manipulations. The factional disputes that had consumed the Senate for months were reaching a crescendo that threatened to paralyze the government at the moment when unified action was most desperately needed. The Grand Admiral's understanding of democratic psychology had allowed him to orchestrate political crises that struck at the very heart of what made the new republic functional as a governing institution. Species that had fought side by side against imperial tyranny were now viewing each other with suspicion and hostility, their ancient prejudices and cultural misunderstandings weaponized by an enemy who understood their psychological vulnerabilities better than they understood themselves. Yet Leia's Alderaanian heritage, which Thrawn had identified as a weakness to be exploited, ultimately provided the strength necessary to transcend the artificial divisions that had been imposed upon the Republic. Her commitment to diplomatic solutions and consensus building, seemingly naive in the face of such sophisticated manipulation, proved to be the key to exposing the artificial nature of the conflicts that were tearing the government apart. The political resolution came not through military victory, but through the patient work of rebuilding trust between species and individuals whose relationships had been poisoned by carefully crafted misinformation campaigns. Leia's ability to see beyond immediate cultural differences to the shared values that had originally united the rebellion became the foundation for a renewed commitment to democratic principles that transcended the divisions Thrawn had sought to exploit. Captain Pellaeon found himself witnessing the end of an era as the Grand Admiral's carefully constructed strategy began to unravel in ways that even Thrawn's genius had not anticipated. The Kaiser's tactician had accounted for every variable except the possibility that his enemies might transcend their own psychological limitations through an act of collective will that defied his anthropological analysis. The final space battle above Bilbringi represented the culmination of everything Thrawn had learned about New Republic tactical doctrine, yet the outcome was determined not by superior strategy, but by individual acts of heroism that operated outside the parameters of his cultural analysis. The Grand Admiral had studied how different species fought and died, but he had failed to account for the transformative power of sacrifice freely chosen in service of ideals that transcended mere survival. Mara Jade's role in Thrawn's downfall carried personal significance that extended beyond military considerations. As the Emperor's hand, she had served a system that valued order above all other considerations, believing that individual freedom was a luxury that the galaxy could not afford in the face of cosmic threats that most beings could not perceive or understand. Her growing relationship with Luke Skywalker represented a fundamental challenge to this worldview, forcing her to confront the possibility that democracy and individual liberty were not signs of weakness, but sources of strength. that enabled civilizations to adapt and grow in ways that authoritarian systems could not match. Her ultimate choice to reject the Emperor's legacy and embrace the uncertainty of freedom became a pivotal moment in the larger struggle between competing visions of galactic governance. The resolution of C'baoth's madness came through Luke's recognition that the fallen Jedi could not be redeemed through conventional means, but could be offered the peace that had eluded him for decades. The confrontation between them was less a battle than an act of compassion that acknowledged the tragedy of what C'baoth had become while refusing to enable the suffering he was inflicting upon others. Luke's understanding of the Force had been deepened by his encounter with Thrawn and C'baoth, teaching him that wisdom required not just knowledge of light and dark, but comprehension of the complex motivations that drove beings toward choices that seemed incomprehensible to others. The path of the Jedi involved not just personal enlightenment, but the courage to extend understanding and compassion even to enemies, whose actions seemed to place them beyond redemption. The collapse of Thrawn's campaign came not through military defeat but through the Grand Admiral's recognition that his fundamental assumptions about the nature of democratic societies had been proven incorrect. The New Republic's ability to overcome the psychological manipulation that should have destroyed them demonstrated resilience that transcended his anthropological models, revealing possibilities for governmental organization that his studies had not prepared him to anticipate. The galaxy had been tested by the collision between order and freedom, and the outcome would reshape how future generations understood the relationship between individual liberty and collective security. The silence that followed the end of Thrawn's campaign was unlike anything the galaxy had experienced in generations. A profound quiet that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of space itself, as civilizations across countless worlds began the slow process of comprehending what they had survived. The New Republic had endured its greatest test not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through a fundamental act of faith in the possibility that diverse beings could choose cooperation over conflict when faced with existential threats to their shared values. Luke Skywalker stood in the ruins of what had once been C'baoth's stronghold, his lightsaber extinguished as he contemplated the debris of a life that had been consumed by the very power it had sought to control. The fallen Jedi's death had brought peace not just to the galaxy, but to a tortured soul whose decades of isolation had transformed wisdom into madness and compassion into cruelty. In the end, C'baoth had found the release that had eluded him. For so long, his final moments marked by a clarity that recalled the noble master he had once been. The Force itself seemed to exhale in relief as the artificial tensions that had been imposed upon the galaxy's natural rhythms finally dissipated. Luke could sense the restoration of balance in ways that went beyond mere political resolution, feeling the return of harmonies that had been disrupted by C'baoth's attempts to impose order through manipulation of the living force. The lesson was profound in its simplicity. True peace could not be manufactured or enforced, but had to emerge from the willing cooperation of free beings, making conscious choices about their shared destiny. Princess Leia's work in rebuilding the political consensus within the New Republic proved to be as challenging as any military campaign, requiring patience and diplomacy that tested every skill she had developed during her years of service to the rebellion. The factional disputes that had nearly torn the government apart left scars that would take years to heal, but they also provided opportunities for deeper understanding between species that had previously interacted only on the surface level. Of political necessity, the revelation that their internal conflicts had been artificially manufactured by external enemies created a sense of shared victimhood that paradoxically strengthened the bonds between former adversaries within the Senate. Bothan senators and Mon Calamari admirals found themselves working together with newfound respect as they recognized how their natural cultural differences had been exploited by enemies who understood their psychological vulnerabilities better than they had understood themselves. Leia's approach to this healing process drew upon her Alderaanian heritage in ways that validated Thrawn's analysis while simultaneously transcending his limitations. The Grand Admiral had correctly identified her cultural programming and its influence on her decision-making processes, but he had failed to account for the transformative power of conscious choice in overcoming inherited patterns of behavior. Leia's ability to recognize and compensate for her own psychological tendencies became a model for how democratic societies could maintain their essential characteristics while defending themselves against manipulation. The broader implications of Thrawn's defeat resonated throughout the galaxy as scholars and strategists began to analyze the campaign that had brought the New Republic to the brink of collapse. The Grand Admiral's fusion of cultural anthropology with military planning represented a revolutionary approach to warfare that would influence tactical thinking for generations to come, even as his ultimate failure demonstrated the limitations of treating civilizations as mere collections of predictable psychological patterns. Military academies across the galaxy began incorporating cultural studies into their curricula, recognizing that future conflicts would require understanding of enemy psychology as much as technical knowledge of weapons and tactics. The lesson that emerged from careful analysis of Thrawn's methods was both inspiring and sobering. Democratic societies possessed inherent strengths that authoritarian analysis could not fully comprehend, but they also carried vulnerabilities that required constant vigilance to protect. Mara Jade's integration into New Republic society proved to be one of the most significant long-term consequences of the crisis, as her unique perspective on Imperial methods provided invaluable insights into how authoritarian systems sought to exploit democratic weaknesses. Her relationship with Luke Skywalker symbolized the possibility of redemption and transformation that lay at the heart of the New Republic's founding ideals, demonstrating that former enemies could become allies when they shared common commitments to justice and freedom. The personal healing that both Luke and Mara experienced through their connection reflected broader themes of reconciliation that would define the post-Thrawn era. The galaxy had been wounded by decades of conflict and manipulation, but those same experiences had created opportunities for deeper understanding between beings who might otherwise have remained strangers to each other's experiences and perspectives. Captain Pelian's decision to seek accommodation with the New Republic represented the pragmatic response of a professional soldier who recognized that the empire he had served no longer existed in any meaningful form. His negotiations with Republic leadership established precedents for how former Imperial personnel could be reintegrated into galactic society without compromising the democratic principles that the New Republic was committed to defending. Imperial remnants that remained scattered throughout the galaxy faced a choice between continuing hopeless resistance or accepting the reality that the galactic political landscape had been permanently transformed. Most chose pragmatic accommodation over ideological purity, contributing their skills and knowledge to the challenging work of rebuilding a civilization that had been torn apart by generations of warfare. The cultural artifacts that Thrawn had collected during his campaign were eventually returned to their worlds of origin, but not before Republic scholars had the opportunity to study the Grand Admiral's analytical methods and understand how art and culture could be weaponized by enemies with sufficient knowledge and patience. This research led to new fields of study that explored the intersection between psychology, anthropology, and strategic planning, ensuring that future generations would be better prepared to recognize and counter such sophisticated forms of manipulation. Galaxy had learned that freedom required not just the courage to fight for principles, but the wisdom to the wisdom to ways not that freedom goes to wisdom to fight for principles, but the fight for principles, but the coconut to come. Understand how those principles could be subverted by enemies who exploited the very openness and diversity that made democratic societies worth defending. The stars above Coruscant had never seemed so peaceful as they did in the quiet hours following the final resolution of the Thrawn crisis. their ancient light washing over a world that had learned to appreciate the fragile nature of the freedom it had fought so hard to achieve. In the highest tower of what had once been the Imperial Palace, Luke Skywalker stood at a vast transparisteel window, watching the endless flow of traffic streams that carried millions of beings about their daily lives, each one a testament to the simple miracle of ordinary existence in a galaxy no longer consumed by the machinery of total war. The Force flowed around him with a serenity that had been absent during the months of crisis, its currents no longer disturbed by the artificial tensions that Sebaeth's madness had imposed upon the natural order. Luke could sense the restoration of balance in ways that transcended mere political resolution, feeling the return of harmonies that connected every living being to the greater tapestry of existence. The galaxy was healing, not just from the wounds inflicted by Thrawn's campaign, but from decades of conflict that had taught entire generations to view war as the natural state of galactic civilization. The wisdom that Luke had gained through his confrontation with the fallen Jedi Master extended far beyond tactical knowledge or strategic insight. He understood now that the path of the Jedi required not just personal enlightenment, but the humility to recognize that even the most noble intentions could become corrupted when divorced from compassion and connection to the living force. Tobiath's tragedy lay not in his fall to the dark side, but in his isolation from the very beings he had sought to protect and guide. In the depths of space, far from the populated systems where the New Republic was rebuilding its shattered confidence, the wreckage of Imperial Star Destroyers drifted in the cold vacuum between stars. These monuments to failed ambition carried within their twisted hull plating the remnants of dreams that had consumed their creators. Dreams of order imposed through superior understanding and perfect control over the chaotic forces that drove galactic civilization. The Chimera itself had become a tomb for Grand Admiral Thrawn's revolutionary approach to warfare, its corridors echoing with the silence of abandoned purpose. The cultural artifacts that had once filled the ship's galleries with alien beauty now seemed like accusatory witnesses to the hubris of believing that any single mind, however brilliant, could comprehend the full complexity of galactic civilization well enough to reshape it according to predetermined patterns. Captain Pelion, surveying the damage aboard his former flagship, reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought him from loyal service to the Empire through the desperate hope of its resurrection to final acceptance of its permanent defeat. The lesson that emerged from his years of service under Thrawn was both humbling and liberating. Military genius, no matter how profound, could not compensate for fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of the societies it sought to conquer or protect. Princess Leia's work in rebuilding the political consensus within the New Republic had evolved from crisis management into something approaching statesmanship, as she helped guide her fractured government toward a deeper understanding of the challenges that democratic societies faced in an uncertain galaxy. The scars left by Thrawn's psychological manipulation would take years to heal completely, but they had also created opportunities for growth and mutual understanding that might never have emerged under less trying circumstances. The conversations that took place in the Senate chambers during the months following the crisis reflected a new maturity in how different species approached their shared governance responsibilities. Bothan senators worked alongside Mon Calamari admirals with a respect born of recognition that their cultural differences, while real and significant, were also sources of strength that made the Republic more resilient than any homogeneous civilization could hope to be. Mara Jade's integration into this new galactic order represented one of the most profound transformations to emerge from the entire crisis. Her journey from the Emperor's hand to trusted ally of the New Republic embodied the possibility of redemption that lay at the heart of democratic ideals, demonstrating that former enemies could become partners when they shared common commitments to justice and freedom. Her relationship with Luke Skywalker had deepened into something that transcended mere romantic attachment, becoming a symbol of the healing that was possible when beings chose trust over suspicion and cooperation over isolation. Their bond represented the synthesis of different traditions and perspectives that would define the galaxy's future, as former Imperial knowledge was integrated with Jedi wisdom to create new understandings of how power could be exercised responsibly. Broader galactic community was also beginning to process the lessons of Thrawn's campaign, as worlds throughout the Republic and beyond recognized that the threat they had faced represented something unprecedented in galactic history. The fusion of military genius with psychological manipulation had created possibilities for conquest that traditional defensive strategies could not have countered, forcing a fundamental reassessment of how free societies could protect themselves, without compromising the very values that made them worth defending. Academic institutions across the galaxy began developing new curricula that integrated cultural studies with strategic planning, recognizing that future conflicts would require understanding of enemy psychology as much as technical knowledge of weapons and tactics. The legacy of Thrawn's methods would live on not in the service of authoritarian ambition, but in the preparation of democratic societies to recognize and counter sophisticated forms of manipulation. As the months passed and the immediate crisis faded into history, the galaxy settled into the rhythm of ordinary existence that had been disrupted for so long by the machinery of total war. Commerce resumed along trade routes that had been disrupted by Imperial raids. Cultural exchanges flourished as different species rediscovered the joy of learning from each other rather than viewing diversity as a source of weakness to be exploited. The stars themselves seemed to approve of this return to normalcy, their ancient light carrying messages of continuity and endurance across the vast distances that separated world from world. In the endless cycle of stellar birth and death, the brief span of galactic civilization appeared as little more than a moment's flicker, but it was a flicker that contained within itself all the dreams and aspirations that made existence meaningful. Whisper that had once threatened to become a storm across eternity had finally been stilled, leaving behind only the gentle murmur of countless voices raised in the eternal conversation between past and future, between what was and what might yet be.